Good day everyone, I am Varney E. Mejias and today we're going to talk about worship in the Old Testament. Worship in the Old Testament has its roots in early narrative of Genesis, particularly in the Garden of Eden, which serves as a symbolic sanctuary where humanity had direct access to God. However, this access was severed due to Adam and Eve's disobedience, illustrating the theme of separation from God that permeates biblical history. We have here Garden of Eden, represents the original dwelling place of God on earth, where Adam and Eve experienced perfect fellowship with Him. Their expulsion from the garden signifies the loss of this immediate access to God, a barrier that remains due to sin. This foundational narrative, it highlights humanity's ongoing search for reconnection with the divine. Next, we have God's revelation. The Bible documents God's relentless pursuit of humanity, illustrated by His seeking of Adam and Eve post-sin. God's self-revelation is not merely informational, but relational. God demonstrates His nature through mighty acts rather than abstract declarations. So the attributes of God such as love and mercy are revealed through His interactions with humanity. Next, we have humanity's search for God. So the early chapters of Genesis depicts a sober view of human nature. Following the expulsion from Eden, the narrative shifts to the concept of sacrifice, beginning with Cain and Abel. Cain's offering of produce is rejected, while Abel's offering of a lamb is accepted, not due to the nature of the offerings, but rather the attitude of the heart. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4 emphasizes that Abel's faith made his sacrifice acceptable, underscoring the principle that worship is rooted in faith rather than the act itself. Next is the role of sacrifice. The absence of explicit commands for sacrifice in these early texts suggests that offering to God was an instinctive response, predating the Mosaic Law. Both Cain and Abel's offerings appeared to be expressions of gratitude rather than atonement, indicating a natural inclination towards worship. This reveals an essential biblical principle. It is in the worshipper's faith that render their offerings acceptable. Next is the birth of music. The origins of music are briefly mentioned, with Jubal emerging as the ancestor of musicians. This contrasts with other ancient cultures where music was often attributed to divine beings. The biblical accounts emphasizes that music was a human invention, reflecting a deeply embedded cultural expression of worship. Next is Noah and worship. In Genesis 6, Noah is depicted as a righteous man who lived in fellowship with God, suggesting a lifestyle of worship. After the flood, Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices, demonstrating an understanding of divine grace and the necessity of gratitude. This act of worship signifies a restoration of relationship with God. Next one is the Tower of Babel. The narrative of the Tower of Babel illustrates humanity's desire for self-importance and security, leading to a form of worship that prioritizes human achievement over divine acknowledgement. So this story reflects the innate human tendency to worship, misdirected towards creation rather than the creator. Next is the ancient culture and their influence on Jewish worship. So it is essential to understand the ancient culture that preceded and influenced them. These reports will examine the religious system of Sumer, Egypt, and Canaan. First is the Sumer. Ur of the Chaldees, located in modern-day southern Iraq, is recognized as the birthplace of Abraham. This city-state, part of Sumer, was one of the earliest known civilizations, boosting a population of approximately 250,000 people. The Sumerians developed advanced system of law, weights and measures, and made significant strides in medicine, geometry, and metallurgy. Next is the religious practices. The Sumerians worshipped a pantheon of gods associated with natural forces, including fertility, the sun, moon, and stars. Families often had personal gods to whom they dedicated small home chapel, and archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals were buried beneath these chapels. Next one is the Egypt. Egyptian religion was marked by its complexity, involving numerous gods, temples, and a class of priests. Singing and instrumental music played vital roles in worship practices, reflecting a rich cultural tradition. Afterlife beliefs. A significant aspect of Egyptian religion was the focus of the afterlife, which was viewed as a distinct continuation of earthly existence, encompassing both rewards and punishments based on one's earthly deeds. The constructions of pyramids and the elaborate treasures and tomb paintings discovered within them exemplify this deep concern with the life after death. And the last one we have Canaan. Canaanite religion bore similarities to that of Ur, particularly in its lack of hope for improved afterlife. Canaanite worship was predominantly centered around the fertility god Baal, with rituals that often included sacred prostitution, reflecting a direct connection to fertility and agricultural cycles. Afterlife beliefs. In Canaanite beliefs, there was no expectation of reward for goodness or punishment for wrongdoing in the afterlife. The dead were thought to be reside in a dark realm beneath the earth, and living individuals could influence the condition of the dead through specific rituals. Failure to perform these rituals could result in the deceased returning as malevolent spirits. So that's all for my report. Thank you.
Good day everyone, I'm Evan Christian L. Padilla. So today I'll discuss about the patriarchs. So we have here 3 bullet points. So let's start on the first bullet point. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the central figures of the patriarchal period. So the patriarchal period refers to a significant era in the history of the Israelites, spanning several generations. The patriarchal period is like that story, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the grandfathers whose lives and the experiences shape the family's identity. So their story is the foundation for many important of religious beliefs and practices. So next bullet point is they are considered the 3 patriarchs of Judaism. So the word patriarchs means father of a tribe or family. In Judaism, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are like the original fathers of the Jewish people. Their lineage is central to Jewish identity and history. Other figures like David, Moses, and Joseph are also known as patriarchs, but the focus is on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. While other important figures in Jewish history are also called patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hold a unique position. Their stories established the foundational covenant between God and the Israelites, upon which much of subsequent Jewish history and religious practice is built. So next slide is God's covenant. God revealed himself to the patriarchs at specific times and places. The exact method of communication is unknown. So, giingon dere, God interacted directly with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the Bible doesn't specify the precise nature of these interactions, whether through visions, dreams, audible voices, or other means. So next is God made a covenant with Abraham, promising him a great nation, the land of Canaan, and blessings for all nations through his descendants. So a covenant is like a sacred promise. So God promised Abraham that his family would become a large and successful nation, that they would own the land of Canaan, and that through them all the people of the world would be blessed. This promise is very important part of a Jewish faith. So next is this covenant was later confirmed for Isaac and Jacob. So the covenant wasn't just a one-time promise to Abraham. It was reaffirmed and strengthened through his son Isaac and the grandson Jacob, ensuring its continuity and importance for future generations. This shows the enduring natures of God's commitment. So next slide is worship in the pre-Mosaic era. So the head of the family or tribe acted as a priest before the formal establishment of the Levitical priesthood in the Mosaic era. The family head held religious authority within his family or tribe. He was responsible for leading worship and making sacrifices. Worship centered on sacrifice, a common practice in many religions. Sacrifice was a significant act of worship, symbolizing devotion, atonement, and seeking God's favor. This practice wasn't unique to the Israelites. Many ancient cultures, including sacrificial offerings in their religions rituals. So the patriarchs built altars throughout Canaan to mark places of divine revelation. Altars serve as designated locations for worship and sacrifice. Their constructions at specific sites indicated places where God had revealed himself to the patriarchs, making these locations sacred. Sacrifices were offered only at specific sites, demonstrating the land's sacredness and God's promise to give it to his people. The restriction of sacrifices to designated places emphasized the holiness of those locations and reinforced God's promise to give the land of Canaan to the Israelites. It wasn't just any land, it was divinely promised and consecrated. Next slide is the time of Moses. So first is the burning bush. Moses' first encounter with God is described as pivotal moment establishing a biblical pattern for worship. The burning bush, when consumed by flames, signifies God's presence. Next is the call to worship. God spoke to Moses, calling him to a special mission. Moses, recognizing the holiness of God, showed his respect by taking off his shoes as a symbol of humility and covering his face. This shows how important it is to approach God with reverence and humility. So next is the flow of worship. The story of Moses and the burning bush outlines a pattern for how we worship God. It starts with our attention being drawn to God. realizing our own limitations and listening to the God message. Then we express our repentance and confessions. And finally, we respond to God's call by following His instructions. So next slide is Mount Sinai. So first is covenant ratification. So the revelation of God of Mount Sinai was crucial for establishing the faith and unity of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was here that God revealed His laws and commandments, forming the basis of their religious and social life. This covenant, established through a series of events, solidified their identity as a God-chosen people and bound them together as a nation. Next is a solemn ritual. The solemn ritual at Mount Sinai involved a series of steps that symbolize the covenant between God and the Israelites. This ritual solidified their commitment to God and marked the beginning of their journey as a chosen people. Next slide is the Covenant of Mount Sinai, a four-part ritual. First is the call to worship. God summoned Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 Israelite leaders to ascend Mount Sinai. Only Moses would ultimately approach God directly. Second is the consecration of the people. So first is proclamation of God's words. Moses relayed God's commandments and ordinances to the people. Next is response by the people. The people pledge obedience, affirming their commitment to follow God's laws. Next is recording the law. Moses documented God's commands. Next is sacrifices by the people. The people offered sacrifices to God. So third, the communication of God's approval. The vision of glory. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 leaders witnessed a glorious theophany on Mount Sinai. Next is communion with God. God revealed Himself to the leaders who then partook in a sacred meal together. Fourth, the home of greater glory. Moses ascended Mount Sinai alone to receive the 10 Commandments, spending 40 days and nights in God's presence. The covenant was renewed annually, likely involving a similar ritual. That's all of my report. Thank you.
The Tabernacles, God's dwelling place among His people. Hi everyone! Today I'm going to talk about the tabernacle, a really important structure in the Old Testament. So, in Exodus, God gives Moses detailed instruction for building a portable sanctuary called the tabernacle. This wasn't just any tent. It was a sacred space where God would dwell among the Israelites. It was a place for worship, sacrifice, and a reminder of God's presence with His people. Now, the word tabernacle comes from the Hebrew word mishkan, which means to dwell or to live in. This points to a deeper meaning. The tabernacle was a symbol of God, Shekinah, which is a Hebrew word referring to the physical manifestation of God's glory and presence. It's like God was actually living inside this tent. The Shekinah is often associated with a bright light, kind of like a halo. But in Exodus 40, we see the Shekinah as the cloud that filled the tabernacle. This cloud was so thick that Moses couldn't even enter the tent. The tabernacle and later the temple were really important symbols to Israelites. They showed that God was with them, no matter where they went. It was a place where they could connect with God and feel His presence in their lives. That's a little bit about Tabernacle. It's a fascinating story of God's desire to be with His people and how He provided a place for them to worship and experience His presence. Description of the tent. Imagine a tent, but not just any tent. This was a carefully designed structure described in detail in Exodus. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a sacred space, a visible representation of God's presence among His people. The next clip is a video of tabernacles. The tabernacles wasn't always in one place. Initially, it was designed to travel with the Israelites as they journeyed towards the Promised Land. But after they settled in Canaan, it was eventually replaced by a more permanent structure in Shiloh, the central place of worship. The tabernacle was more than just a building. It was a powerful symbol of God's presence, His covenant with His people, and that means of atonement for their sins. It presents God's desire to dwell with His people in their ongoing relationship with Him. Worship in the tent. This passage offers a glimpse into their ceremonies and the significance of tabernacle as the center of their worship. The ceremony described in Exodus 24 reveals a multifaceted approach to worship, combining sacrifice, law, and covenant renewal. First, there was the offering at the altar. This wasn't just any altar. It was a stone altar of burnt offering with 12 pillars, likely representing the 12 tribes of Israel. A sacrifice was offered, and a crucial part of the ritual involved the sprinkling of blood. Half of the blood was sprinkled on the altar itself. This act symbolized atonement for the sins of the people, a cleansing offered to God. The sacrifice was a tangible representation of their need for forgiveness and God's willingness to provide it. Next, the ceremony involved the law. Moses, acting as a God's mediator, presented the law to the people. Remember, the 10 Commandments, the very foundation of God's covenant, were carefully preserved within the Ark of the Covenant, housed in the Holy of Holies within the tabernacle. This part of the ceremony emphasized the importance of obedience to God's commands as a key aspect of the relationship with Him. The law wasn't just a set of rules, it was a guide for living a life pleasing to God. Lastly, the people demonstrated their commitment to this covenant. They publicly pledged their obedience to God's law. This act of commitment was then sealed by Moses, sprinkling the remaining blood over the people. This act symbolized the ratification of covenant, signifying the God's forgiveness and the people's obedience were linked. The blood acting as a binding agent, uniting God and His people in sacred covenant. The ancient Israelites had 5 main offerings they could give to God. These offerings were described in the book of Leviticus, chapters 1-7. Each offering had a special purpose and was given in a specific way. First, chapter 1, Burnt Offering. This offering was a way to show complete devotion to God. It was a sacrifice where the entire animal was burned on the altar. This offering could be a bull, sheep, goat, or even a bird. It symbolized giving everything to God. Chapter 2, Grain Offering. This offering was made of flour, oil, and incense. It was a gift of the fruits of the land and represented thankfulness to God for the harvest. It was a way to show gratitude to God for providing food. Chapter 3, Fellowship Offering. This offering was a way to celebrate and share a meal with God. It was a sacrifice of an animal. Part of the animal, including the fat, was burned as a gift to God, and the rest was shared as a meal. It symbolized a close relationship with God. Chapter 4, Sin Offering. This offering was made when someone had done something wrong. It was a sacrifice of an animal. The blood of the animal was used to cleanse the person from sin. This offering symbolized asking for forgiveness and cleansing from wrongdoing. Chapter 5, Guilt Offering. This offering was made when someone had done something wrong and needed to make amends. It was a sacrifice of a ram. The person had to return the stolen goods or pay back what they owed. And they also had to give a portion of the value of the stolen goods to the priest. This offering symbolized taking responsibility for action and making things right. The 5 offerings in Leviticus can be categorized into 2 groups. First, offerings of adoration and praise. Burnt offering, grain offering, and fellowship offering. These offerings were sweet savor offerings, meaning they were pleasing to God and represented a positive, joyful communion with Him. They were burned with the camp, signifying a shared space of worship and closeness. Second, offering for sin offering and guilt offering. These offerings were not considered sweet savor because they dealt with sin, which was unpleasant for God. They were burned outside the camp, signifying a separation from the holy presence of God until the sin was atoned for. In conclusion, the tabernacle stands as a powerful testament to God's desire for a close relationship with His people. More than just a tent, it was a carefully constructed sanctuary, a visible symbol of God's presence dwelling among the Israelites. The tabernacle wasn't merely a place of worship, it was a tangible expression of God's covenant with His people, a place where they could experience His forgiveness, learn His law, and feel His presence in their lives. Its temporary nature, initially designed for travel, and its eventual replacement with a more permanent structure in Shiloh, highlight the ongoing evolution of the Israelites' relationship with God, always centered around His desire for closeness and communion. Thank you.